Welcome to the Passages podcast. I'm Christy Cooney of thestateofthearts.co.uk. We publish features and reviews on arts, culture and politics from cities around the country. In this series, I'll be talking to writers and other public figures about a passage of text of their choice, be it an excerpt of prose, or a poem, or a historical speech, or whatever. I want to talk to people about passages that had a formative effect on them, or that they think are important at this juncture in history, or that they just think are particularly brilliant. I'm very pleased to say that my very first guest is Rafael Behr, a wonderful columnist for The Guardian and former political editor of The New Statesman. Rafael, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, thanks for having me.
Now, the passage you've chosen is Wilfred Owen's Parable of the Old Man and the Young. So I'm going to ask you to start us off by reading it through.
Okay. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram, caught in a thicket by its thorns, offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son and half the seed of Europe one by one.
Thanks so much. Now, so tell us why you chose this poem.
I chose the poem primarily because it's a brilliant poem, and I came across this many years ago. I studied a bit of war poetry probably at school, and Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooks were always the big names, and Dulce et Decorum Est is probably the best known Wilfred Owen poem. And this one I hadn't come across, and it was around Armistice Day and I was looking through some war related material for something, and I just struck this I saw this poem, and it struck me as just qualitatively different from a lot of the other war poetry that I'd come across, and it really hit me in a very different way, and I couldn't quite work out what was so effective about it, but it really stayed with me. And so every November, when you get to the Armistice Day, Remembrance Day sort of season, this is the one item that always sort of comes back to me. And then now we're around the sort of centenary of all the First World War commemoration. So last year was the centenary of the Somme. Next year is going to be the centenary of there'll be a big one, 100 years since the end of the First World War. So there's just been a lot of thinking about the First World War going on. And what I particularly like about this one poem is that it, for me, it's a difficult thought to express. I'm going to try and express it. Is that it seems to capture simultaneously what is very immediate and present about that war, and the sense that it's also 100 years, that's actually a long time ago, it's receding from historical memory, and some of the cultural references and the things that would connect us to the people that actually fought that war are fading away into a more kind of ancient realm of history. It's just not quite as modern as it was. Even quite recently, the First World War felt more modern. The number of people who fought in it are passing away. The number of people who would remember that as a present part of their lives are passing away. So, I think it's chiefly because of the sort of biblical imagery, and this is why when you asked me to choose a text, I was interested in talking about this one. The sense that it's referring to things. It's got a whole set of cultural connotations that are sort of reaching back, almost sort of fading further and further, receding back in time. And that just sort of spoke to me. It sort of was an appealing thing to talk about.
Mm. And on this subject of it being different to a lot of other war poetry, I know what you mean in that when you read it, it's a much more, particularly poems like Dulce et Decorum Est or a lot of Wilfred Owen's best known stuff, there's a much more almost accusatory tone to it. In Dulce et Decorum Est, it's sure there's an anger there, but it's aimed at jingoism and enthusiasm for war, and most of the way he makes that point is just by describing the life of the soldier and trying to bring it home to people for whom it's not a reality. Whereas here there's very definitely an explicit accusation levelled at the people who are organising this war, isn't there?
Yeah, and there's something, but it doesn't come straight away. This is the thing that I mean, as you say, it's not set initially sort of in the trenches on the front line, and it's a brilliant piece of writing. I went back actually and looked at the verses from the King James Bible text, from which is the version of the story of Abraham not sacrificing Isaac that it alludes to. I mean, I wonder, is it worth unpacking that story for people listening to this? Because it's the story in Genesis where essentially God says to Abraham, you need to go and make a burnt offering, make a sacrifice, and it's your son you have to sacrifice. And he goes and he prepares everything, and as in this poem, Isaac says, where's the lamb for this slaughter? And Abraham says, well, I'm going to sacrifice my son because that's what God wants. And then an angel appears and says, steady on, okay, we get it. You're properly afraid of God. You will do as he commands. Don't sacrifice your son. That would be a crazy idea. Behold, there is an animal to sacrifice caught in the thicket over there. And what's more, you'll now get God's blessing and you will go forth and multiply and your seed will be strong. So Wilfred Owen's audience for this, everyone who came across this poem, more or less would have been much more familiar with the Bible and these Bible stories in that particular text as well than probably most of us are. And would have immediately spotted the deep subversion in this. So it builds the story almost exactly as it is in the most familiar translation of the book of Genesis. And then he just seeds in really gently the beginnings of the fact that actually what we're talking about here is the war. So right up until it's line sort of 6 or 7, which says, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Up until that point, you're 100% still in Bible times. And then Abraham bounded the youth. That's still pretty much, in the book of Genesis. And it says with belts and straps. And that's the only moment you go, well, hang on a second, this now word, no belts and straps in Genesis. Suddenly you're sensing that we're moving into modern times. And then the next line, builded parapets and trenches. And all of a sudden you realise he's basically yanked you onto the sort of the Western Front. And then it still continues in that sort of biblical idiom, right up until the sort of the reveal that you have from the book of Genesis. Behold, there is the ram for the burnt offering. You don't have to kill your son. And then just one thing that I really love about this poem is up until that point, that line, offer the ram of pride instead of him. That's line 14. Yeah, so, which is a sonnet length. So you've got basically a complete sonnet there. Again, rhythmically, and it's in iambic pentameter. It's in the kind of loose iambic pentameter. So rhythmically, your reader knows that you just sense that that's basically your finishing point. It's mapped onto the story of the Bible, and you can sacrifice the ram, and that's how it ends. And then you have the extra 2 lines. That's not a sonnet. It's got these other 2 lines. It says, no, Abraham said, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to kill every one of the youth of Europe because that's easier to do for me than as the sort of the patriarch figure famously than swallowing my pride. And then the idea that the sort of the payoff in the Bible version is that because of Abraham's sort of deference to God, he's blessed with very fruitful seed, to use the terminology. The exact version here, the older patriarchal generation of Europe going into the First World War basically killed their children. And it's the subtlety, as you were saying, it's different. It's not in the kind of the grit and the grime of the trenches that the impact is. It's taking a sort of macro bigger step back and just making very, very succinct away that moral point about what actually happened there. And that is sort of effective, as I say, has a punch it's not in a different way. It's not sort of that sort of narrative punch of a lot of First World War testimony.
Well, and what I love about the last line is, like you say, there's the hints as it goes through about what the real topic is. But I love how when you hit the last line, the whole poem, especially when you read it on the page, kind of unfurls backwards before you. And the last line, the last few words, one by one, I think is
it's gruesome, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, it's basically systematically sacrificing, because it's quite a shocking story. I mean, the Bible story, the original one, it's classic, it's quite hardcore Old Testament. It's not messing about, and the idea of even the idea of the demand that someone sacrifice their own son, it reaches back to a much sort of harsher, more brutal idiom. So again, bringing that back, as you say, that one by one, that there's nothing accidental about it. I mean, it's kind of premeditated, systematic destruction of a generation of people.
Well, and particularly when you read a bit of the history of the First World War, there's almost this sense that you can forgive the fact that there was a willingness to go to war because they all thought it would be over by Christmas, or that's what the history of it says. But then by the time, like you said, you mentioned the Somme earlier, by the time you get to those big battles of Verdun and the Somme of 1916, this is a war that's unfolding day by day, and it's just become a war of attrition, and that's almost a stated policy.
Well, what's extraordinary also about it, these things are sort of cliches now in a way because they've been gone over so many times, but it still amazes me that you didn't need to introduce conscription until very late in the war, because there were so many people who would have seen it as their duty to go and fight for king and country. And for those who were a little bit ambivalent about that as a concept, or who had started to get vibes, that Christmas had passed and then another Christmas, and maybe this wasn't as going to be as straightforward as had been advertised, there was enough moral pressure from teachers and parents and fiancés and everything else. You didn't basically want to be a coward, so you had to go. So that generation were bullied and pressured into laying down their lives. By sheer coincidence, I recently reread All Quiet on the Western Front, which obviously comes from the German perspective, but is essentially the same narrative in many respects, of people who were made to feel by their elders that going off and fighting for the Kaiser was an entirely non-negotiable rite of passage and something you had to do for everyone else. And the anger, as the volunteer soldiers realised that they'd been completely stitched up and this was entirely pointless. That sense of, is described as a kind of living death, that you can't go back to your old life, and all the values that you had been taught to live by are corrupted by this massive betrayal, that all the figures of authority that you previously were taught to defer to have mobilized their great authority, their great sort of moral leverage over you, to send you to go and murder people just like you and probably be killed. And so that generation came back from the war so profoundly traumatized. I don't think any of us can really begin to understand the sort of psychic and emotional shockwaves that the survivors of that would then bring into Europe. And it was that trauma that, in many ways, and again, I think this is sort of underappreciated a little bit when we go forward and talk about the politics of appeasement in the 1930s, and how it was that so many people looked at what was happening in the rise of fascism and the rise of Hitler in Germany, and you sort of couldn't see that this was something that just needed an aggressive and forceful response. Well, part of it was because of the experience of the First World War, and people thinking the one thing above anything else is you mustn't go back to Europe being at war. And that, it's easy looking back now from the perspective of after 1945 and saying, well, appeasement was obviously stupid, naive, and wrong. I think there would, for the generation that had sort of understood the trauma of the First World War, it's a more comprehensible dilemma, I think.
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier on Siegfried Sassoon. I came across, reading around this poem, the declaration that he had read out in Parliament. He gave a letter to a sympathetic member and asked them to read it out in 1917. And I've got an excerpt here. He says, "I believe that the war upon which I entered as one of defence and liberation has become a war of aggression and conquest. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. I make this protest because I believe it may help to destroy the callous complacency with which those at home regard agonies, which they do not share, and which they have not enough imagination to realise." And what's amazing is that he was interned for that. The generals had him declared mad.
Well, it's not.
And it just interested me that he's saying what he's saying there is not a million miles away from what Wilfred Owen is saying in that poem there.
Well, Wilfred Owen idolised Siegfried Sassoon, and also like this, the poem that we're talking about, and most of his other work was published posthumously, which is worth mentioning.
Yeah.
Because he died just before the army was killed in action, just before the armistice. But what's fascinating about that is and again, it's a really interesting concept. This slightly brings us into our time. This idea that there's a particular kind of courage involved in standing up when there is a sort of force 10 patriotic gale blowing in one direction, and standing up and saying, "You're just wrong." Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of looks a bit sort of treasonous to say everything that you're saying, everything that the elders and betters and older generation are saying about a necessary thing that the country has to do is just wrong. And what's interesting is simultaneously it's very hard to imagine anything equivalent on that scale happening now, because we just, I think, thankfully, mercifully, do not have the same overarching forces of class deference that would mean that conscription point again. The idea that you can sort of mobilise and you can crank people up into a kind of patriotic, nationalistic fervour over certain things, but I don't really see that you would then actually get people queuing around the block to enlist and to go and fight in a war on a voluntary basis, possibly get themselves killed in the name of king and country. I just don't think that sort of cultural apparatus exists anymore, and so it almost seems like a disservice to the memory of the people who both fought in the First World War and the dissenters, to draw analogies with where we are at the moment. But I do find it fascinating when you get this sense, you look at some of the headlines that we have around Brexit and the way that there is this, or at least on one side of the argument, this determination to ramp it up into a kind of nationally galvanising project, any opposition to which is kind of weaselly and borderline treasonous. It's always worth remembering that whole idiom, that whole sort of the structure of an argument that says, by voicing your dissent against this, that is in itself a kind of treacherous act, albeit in dilute form now, is a really toxic way of conducting a conversation. And it's kind of, if not actually physically deadly anymore, it's kind of intellectually deadly. It's such a stultifying way of crushing a sort of civilized conversation about what is and isn't a good idea in politics.
Well, I mean, there are, particularly on the topic of Europe, there are two ways that people like to invoke at least the Second World War, which is, one is to say that those soldiers died, that Britain would be kept free and independent, and the other is to say they died that Europe might be peaceful and indeed united. Do those two visions, or at least their proponents, necessarily come into conflict at some point, do you think?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting that there's the data in terms of how people voted. It's not a sort of slam dunk, argument one way or another. But there is evidence to suggest that we don't know probably that older people were more likely to vote Leave. There is a correlation there. But then the very elderly, you get a little tick back towards Remain. And just, I know an anecdote doesn't make data, but it does make data, but doesn't make sufficient data on which to build an argument. But I know a sort of 93, 94-year-old man who happens to be my wife's grandfather, so my children's great-grandfather, and pretty much the last time he's still alive, but the last time he was independently mobile and able to go out and go for a walk himself and do something was to get down to a polling booth to vote Remain last June, because he was a veteran of the war, and he very much understood it in the latter of the two propositions you put forward, which is that if you've seen what European nationalism does, which came to its apogee in the middle of the 20th century, you don't mess with that stuff. You don't gamble with the forces of European nationalism, and you understand the European project as conceived in its most idealistic form, which was to bring the nations and the peoples of Europe together, so that they would be so bound together in economic and cultural and political collaboration that there'd be no incentive or no reason to ever go to war ever again. Then you have, I think, a sort of a trope that comes actually from a generation that slightly sort of missed the war, more baby boomy generation, who grew up not with the experience of fighting the war, but whose formative experiences were the sort of carnival of patriotism and justifiable triumphalism. I mean, let's not forget that it was a good thing that the Allies won that war, and that the role Britain played in that was utterly heroic and brilliant. But also, famously, as Churchill said, our finest hour. And if you've decided as a culture and a country that your finest hour was a moment in sort of 1941, then it sort of feels like it's downhill all the way from there. And I think this is a roundabout way of answering your question, but I'm struck by the fact, and I think this really gets to the heart of what is wrong in many ways, what is problematic, I should say, with the way with the Brexit debate as we've had it, that the decision to join the EEC, as it then was, in the early 1970s, came at a moment where Britain was really feeling down on itself. It was in a sort of state of national low self-esteem, because having won the war and generally sort of really sort of surfed that wave of "won't be great" for a couple of decades, you notice that France and Germany are doing really well. The rest of Europe, a bit of Marshall Plan money and a bit of ingenuity, for various reasons, is doing rather well. And the UK is thinking, okay, well, actually, we've lost our empire. This is all a bit embarrassing and humiliating. We need to basically throw our lot in with this European project. Now, that's a position of supplication and weakness. And that was a kind of a moment of shame for a lot of people. You just feel embarrassed. And if anyone looks back on things that they regret, or the things that you think now, imagine a moment that you feel uncomfortable about from the past, or that you don't like, a memory you don't like. It won't be physical pain. It won't even be loss, because you can deal with that. It'll be something really embarrassing. It'll be shame. That's the most burning. That's the feeling. If you could obliterate a memory from your head, never have that memory again, it'll be a memory of shame. And there was an element of shame in the decision for the UK to join the European Union, which meant it kind of had to be expunged. And for that generation, so not the generation that fought the war, but just the sort of baby boom older ones who really voted Leave quite big numbers. Yeah. For the Farage generation, generation to whom Nigel Farage really speaks, that's the Brexit that had a lot of that in it, that sense of it was always a bit embarrassing that we felt we had to do this, we shouldn't have to do that, we can stand on our own, we can do our own thing, we can be independent. And it took a lot of, it brings us back to the Wilfred Owen poem, that it took a lot of swallowing pride to say, no, we're just a sort of medium-sized, quite punchy, but not superpower European country. we're a pretty strong economy. We've got nuclear power, nuclear weapons. Seat on the UN Security Council. So yeah, we rock. In the general global pecking order. But it's probably still big picture in our interest to club together with Germany, France, Italy, these other countries, Belgium, Slovenia, and say, right, let's all be part of this wider European project. That's in our interest. There was that required swallowing a certain amount of national pride that for a lot of people just wasn't a kind of culturally palatable thing to do. It hadn't been for a very, very long time. I'm trying to phrase this in a way that isn't sort of critical or sneering or dismissive of those emotions. I just think that is part of our national identity as a country. We just weren't up for it, the whole European project in the bigger way that you described, which is a really long way of answering your question. But the short answer is yes.
Will then this period be the equivalent for our generation, or at least for the sort of 20 to 40 year olds now, when we've got Theresa May having to get straight to Donald Trump's White House?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? There's a lot of commentary around about how, it all feels a bit 1920s again, and, you look at what's happening with Donald Trump, and there's not really any doubt in my mind that he has a kind of fascistic temperament. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to say that he is an organised fascist, because I don't think it's as coherent as that. But there is, so I think, but nonetheless, we're certainly about to see the resilience of the US Constitution in its ability to check a kind of tyrannical sort of mood. That's going to be tested, which will be interesting. I think what will be in answer to your question, I think the generation that I think will be politically coming of age now. I mean, simple point. There's no doubt that Brexit is obviously going to be the defining moment. The whether or not people were old enough to vote for it, or old enough to vote and didn't. Thanks, guys. Or did vote for it and then come to regret it, or vote for it and it turns out to be brilliant. Let's not exclude the possibility that this is actually was the right thing to do. I mean, I was a Remainer, but let's keep an open mind. Whichever of those outcomes, it's going to be fascinating to think that it will be settled one way or another by the time someone who was, let's say you put yourself in the position of someone who was 17 on June the 22nd last year, then is going to be able to vote in the next general election. You'll be looking at a set of political choices where the single biggest thing that is going to affect the whole of your future, and if you then have children, your children's future has fundamentally set the destiny of the nation that you belong to on a different course, was settled on the eve of you acquiring suffrage. And that's a massive thing to happen. I don't think any equivalent thing happened to me when I was that age. And it is, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think it feels facile and sort of disrespectful to anyone who has been involved in a war to compare it to a war. But just in terms of the sort of seismic structural activity, things on which the history pivots, it's really big. So again, which also sounds really trite, but I don't think any of us has yet fully grasped, because when you're living in the middle of something that big, you just sort of get on with it. But fast forward 10, 15 years, you'll look back on 2016, 2017, surely as epoch-shaping kind of pivots in history.
We should touch. You touched on it briefly earlier, but we talked before about the presence of the Bible in this poem. Just to change tack slightly, does the impact of a poem like this rely on it being, as it were, alive in the public consciousness? The Bible being, because you could quite easily imagine the James Joyce of centuries hence writing his Ulysses using some part of the Bible narrative. So clearly, stories or legends or religious or otherwise can be used in literature or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, does the gravity of a poem like this rely on the role that Christianity has played in Britain?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. My instinct is that it does up to a point. I mean, I'm an atheist, but I had enough of a religious education to be quite familiar with Old Testament stories, and so I knew that Abraham and Isaac story, and I do think it's. The poem is, I wouldn't say it's inaccessible if you literally never come across that before, but it would be quite baffling. I mean, it would take a lot of footnotes and commentary to unpack what that means, and then you appreciate it, but then you've introduced a layer of distinction, a layer of alienation from your appreciation of it. Whereas if you were a devout church-going Christian and you read that and you got to the final two lines, it's a punch in the face, really. It's a very different way of experiencing the same text. But I think this is true of lots of things. This is true of knowing, sort of canon Shakespeare, or you mentioned Ulysses. I mean, knowing classical texts. It's interesting. I'm a little bit old-fashioned about this. I just feel it's just familiarity with these canon in the secular sense works, that there's the foundation blocks of the culture that we live in. It's just it's like knowing your times tables in maths. Obviously you've got a calculator, so you don't really need them, but if you've got them there, your capacity for mental arithmetic to make connections and do things quickly and instinctively is that much richer. Now, I know that this is actually probably more controversial. I suspect this is more controversial than I realise, because, I mean, the other problem with that canon stuff is it was all written by, well, it wasn't all written, but it was substantially written by, white men in a context where now we look back and you can see all the kind of problematic values and social mores that would make you want to bring critical distance to that. And you can't teach everything to everyone, and so there is this question: if you're emphasizing the importance of Shakespeare's hard to disentangle if you're not familiar with Shakespearean language, would you really want to sit every school child down and make them learn Old Testament Bible stories if you're not in the business of indoctrinating them into the Christian faith? So I wouldn't go so far as to say, in a sort of grumpy, buffed and tufted, regimental tie, old man kind of way, isn't it a tragedy that people don't know their Bible stories anymore? But I do think you lose something if you don't have that, and there will be countless examples of equivalent things that I don't know, which mean that when I come to some text or film or piece of culture, the lack of that cultural apparatus means I'm just not appreciating it as well as I ought to. Ought to is wrong, as well as I could.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but I'll ask you to close the episode by reading once more Wilfred Owen's The Parable of the Old Man and the Young.
Yeah, with pleasure. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth a knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe one by one.
Rafael Behr, thanks so much for being our guest on the Passages podcast.
Thanks for having me.